This is Khirbet Qumran. Once in the time of Jesus, it was home to a people that have since been lost to time, the Essenes. This monastic community was obsessed with preserving sacred writings for future generations. Near its ruins are 11 caves that for centuries held in secret what became the most important archaeological discovery of the 20th century: the Dead Sea Scrolls, a treasure trove of hundreds of previously undiscovered sacred writings. One of them, the War Scroll, describes an epic spiritual battle between the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness. The Essenes believed that one man, a mighty spiritual warrior, would lead these Sons of Light to victory. They called him the Messiah. In the spring of 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd was wandering this area just outside of Khirbet Qumran when he came across a few ancient manuscripts. This accidental discovery led to the unearthing of hundreds of ancient scrolls of biblical and extra-biblical writings, many of them still completely intact. In the world of archaeology, a few letters on a manuscript are more valuable than piles of gold, making this discovery an absolute mother lode. Out of these caves emerged one of the greatest archaeological discoveries ever made. These writings would most likely have composed the library of the lost and mysterious Jewish sect, known as the Essenes. The Essenes were a highly pious and devout monastic community, mostly living in separate communal societies, like the one here in Qumran, dedicating their lives to preserving scripture. By the time of Jesus, the Essenes had largely removed themselves from Jerusalem, believing its leadership and temple system had become corrupt. You see, the temple that existed in Jesus' time was not the original one. This one had recently been built by King Herod to bring back a precious structure from Jewish history. The first temple had been built almost 1,000 years before by King David's son, Solomon. From the moment it was created, this structure could not have been more precious to the Israelites, giving God a permanent home among his people. Yet, a few hundred years later, an unimaginable tragedy struck. The Babylonians invaded and destroyed Jerusalem along with the temple. God's presence had left them. With their temple destroyed and God seemingly having abandoned his people, they were taken into captivity. This horrific event left lasting scars on the collective minds of the people of Israel. That is why the Essenes felt such an immense obligation to be pious, to please God and to not incur something as horrible as that event to happen again. The destruction of the first temple was the defining moment for the first century Jewish world.
Understanding that mindset of Jesus' world and the great expectations that came with it is important if we're going to understand Jesus the Messiah in the Gospels. And there's a lot about that world that we'll never be able to comprehend, but a lot of us do understand how a tragic destruction can leave lasting scars, especially when we think back on what happened on the morning of September 11, 2001. It's probably the defining moment of the 21st century, And the shock and terror of that day are no longer as near in our collective memories, but so many aspects of our modern reality can be traced back to it. The war on terror, elevated security, government surveillance, to name just a few. So to try and gain a sense of the scars those attacks left on us, on this city, I headed down towards Ground Zero on the anniversary of the attacks. There was a lot of imagery you might expect. But then I came across a sight I wasn't expecting to see. A group of Mennonites singing. I spoke to one, Jonathan, to see what was up. Basically, he told me they were just there to try to add something positive to a day that is so packed with tragic memories.
We are here to bring peace and joy, and that's what we're here for, and that's what we're here today.
It was an unexpectedly peaceful scene. Outside of that, it was much more tumultuous. There were, of course, the 9/11 truthers, angry and unconvinced of the traditionally accepted narrative of that day. There were others who saw the event as an apocalyptic sign of the end. Then there were displays of outright hate and anti-Semitism. It was a reminder that there are those for whom events like this cast a darker shadow, bringing out the worst in them.
In addition to living in the shadow of the destruction of the first temple, the people of Jesus' world had to live under the tyranny of Roman oppression. This meant high taxation and frequent abuse from the Roman authorities, people who were occupying and violating their sacred land. It was a time of misery and despair. But if there was one glimmer of hope shared among the people of Israel, it was the great expectation that one day there would be one who would come to save them from this misery: the Messiah. The Hebrew Bible portrays a very specific and unique profile of what the Messiah would be. The Messiah could not just be any revolutionary. He had to fill these very specific and seemingly incompatible roles. First, he had to be a prophet, someone who fought for the immediate well-being of his people. Second, he had to be a priest, someone who served as a bridge to God. Finally, he also had to be a king, someone who would free his people from oppression and establish a new kingdom. The Gospels make the case that Jesus was in fact this Messiah. But he was not the one his people were expecting. Perhaps our best way of understanding Jesus the Messiah is through the story of one of his most prominent disciples, Simon Peter. This was Peter's homeland, Galilee, a beautiful, fertile region. It was a land of farmers and fishermen, a picturesque oasis in the middle of a barren landscape. But to the Romans, it was primarily known as a turbulent region of revolutionaries. The primary group of revolutionaries, a kind of guerrilla fighting group founded by Judas of Galilee, was known as the Zealots. They loved their homeland and hated the Romans, doing everything in their power to drive them out of their land. They would frequently hide in these caves overlooking the Sea of Galilee, setting up ambushes on the Roman troops and caravans. It's quite likely that Peter belonged to this group of revolutionaries. And in his time traveling with Jesus, Peter would have started to take notice that Jesus was beginning to fulfill these three roles of the Messiah: prophet, priest, and king. As that's happening, Jesus decides to take Peter and the disciples here. In the first century, it was known as Caesarea Philippi, a Roman city named after Caesar that served as a garrison for the Roman legion. This would have gotten Peter's blood boiling. They were now overlooking the stronghold of the enemy. Why would Jesus have brought them here? Clearly, they must be on the precipice of something big. There, with thousands of hated Roman soldiers nearby, Jesus asks Peter a question: "Who do you say I am?" Seizing the moment, Peter responds, "You are the Messiah." Here, by this Roman stronghold, Peter makes a bold declaration of faith. This man, Jesus of Nazareth, is the Messiah, the one his people have been waiting for. But unfortunately, as we will soon see, Peter's faith is mixed with hatred and violence.
It may not be the first thing we talk about when we remember 9/11, but for many of us, that day and the new realities created as a result made a dramatic impact on our perception of faith. To see something so terrible committed by religious radicals, all for the sake of their faith, revealed to us the horrors of what happens when faith mixes with hatred and violence. It's especially impacted how many in the Western world perceive Islam. When I spoke with Imam Shamsi Ali, I asked him about the misperceptions about Islam that have come as a result.
Primarily, I have to blame my own community first, because some Muslims mispractice the religion.
He said that any institution claiming to be an Islamic state that practices violence and oppression, that's not Islam.
You know, you cannot talk about Islam without freedom, without justice, without giving opportunities to the people to express themselves.
It's difficult to have people fundamentally misunderstand your faith, and it's not easy to change misperceptions when all people see on the news are radicals corrupting their faith with hatred and violence.
It's because there are some Muslims who are doing it. So I have to blame my own community first for being mispracticing the religion, and that caused some non-Muslims misunderstand the religion. And September 11 tragedy basically is the anti-climax of that. It's the pinnacle of this misconception.
He mentioned how, shortly after the attacks, a Christian friend of his approached him holding a Quran.
He said, I bought this Quran because it's mentioned that terror is in the Quran. So I wanted to find where terror is in the Quran. And he said to me, the more I read to find terror in the Holy Quran, the more I find good things. So that's what happened now in America. Islam is exposed, both negative and positive. At the end of the day, it will be positive. And there are many, many Americans who learn Islam and becomes more convinced that Islam is just like other religions. It's about how to live our life decently, how to be a nice person, basically.
And the world created in the wake of 9/11 has impacted our view of faith on a level beyond just misperceiving someone else's. What happened that day was so awful, along with the horrifying attacks that continue to take place as an almost daily reality. They raise hard questions. How could someone possibly do that in the name of faith, in the name of God? Even more, how could God allow this to happen? But the important thing to remember in all of that is that these are not expressions of faith. It's what happens when faith is mixed with hatred and violence, and that is a truly ugly mixture. September 11, 2001 is a day that this country has pledged to never forget. A lot of powerful memories come to mind when we look back on that day, and sometimes those memories involve faith. On 9/11, we witnessed the horror of what radical, hateful, violent faith is capable of. And in the wake of that horror, some of us were forced to re-examine, wrestle with, and perhaps even question our personal faith.
And after his bold declaration of faith here at Caesarea Philippi, Peter's faith was about to be shaken to its core by a dramatic moment in a garden. Peter's bold declaration of Jesus as the Messiah is a pivotal moment in the gospel narrative. Peter understood a fundamental aspect of who Jesus was. But unfortunately, he completely misunderstood the role this Messiah was going to play. In Peter's mind, Jesus would be the strong warrior Messiah they were all longing for, one who would drive out the hated Romans, restoring their sacred land to them. Sometime later, when Jesus led his disciples to Jerusalem, the city viewed as the center of the world, these great expectations would have built up even more in Peter. In the Gospels, when Jesus and his disciples enter into Jerusalem, there is a powerful sense that something big is about to happen. Shortly after their arrival, they share a quiet moment at night in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus stops to pray. For Peter, this is the calm before the storm. He knows that at any moment, Jesus' revolution is about to be unleashed upon the world. The moment seemingly arrives as a band of soldiers comes looking for Jesus. Peter the Zealot is ready, pulling out his sword and landing a blow on one of those soldiers, named Malchus. Then Jesus does something that would have completely caught Peter off guard. He tells Peter to put the sword away, and he gives himself up willingly to be arrested. In that moment, here, in this garden, all of Peter's hopes, dreams, and aspirations were completely shattered.
A garden is a place to be able to get away from the craziness of life, a place to find peace, to connect with something more fundamental. That's what Central Park is, a huge space right in the heart of the city that lets you get away from the city. But for Peter, in that Garden of Gethsemane, his worst fears had found him. When I try to understand what Peter might have been feeling there, there's a specific memory I go back to that day when everything changed.
My first memory of 9/11 is my grandmother calling me on the phone in a panic, telling me that the towers were on fire and I needed to turn on the TV. So I rushed over to a TV and saw both of the Twin Towers on fire. And all of these questions come to your head. Who's behind this? Why is this happening? What does this mean? And then I remember that feeling of seeing that first tower fall, and then the other one fell. And you just think, what is going on? How is this possible? How many people were in those buildings? What's going on? I remember it was a Tuesday, and it was pajama day in our school. So we were all dressed in our pajamas, which made the whole day even more bizarre. And they gathered us together and explained what little they could, but that whole day for us was just fear and confusion all day long.
Feeling helpless, scared, powerless, not understanding what was going on or what it meant. Like so many of us, that's how I felt that morning. And I think it's a window into how Peter must have felt in that garden as well. For Peter, in that garden, everything changed.
For Peter, Jesus' arrest in Gethsemane was absolutely devastating. It showed him that Jesus was not the warrior Messiah he was expecting. After all, what kind of Messiah would allow himself to be taken to his death? As Jesus was dragged back into the city, Peter followed behind, remaining hidden through the dark streets of Jerusalem as Jesus was taken back to the high priest for his trial. Peter's night was about to get much worse.
What happens next is a pretty dramatic scene. Maybe it's best if an actor portrays it.
Now here's a drama. Here's a drama for you. Peter, lurking, covering his face. He doesn't want to be recognized as being one of them. One of them. Right. And so he follows along. And some woman busts him right out there when he's trying to see what's happening with Jesus. His heart is breaking because of it, but he doesn't want it to happen to him. Right. So a woman said, "Hey, you one of them. I've seen you before. Didn't I see you? Aren't you from Nazareth? Are you that fisherman?" No, it ain't me. No, you're wrong. You must be mistaken. No, it's got to be you. I know it's you. You talk like them. You sound like them. No, I'm telling you, it's not me. Hey, doesn't he sound like, isn't he one of the, look, blah, 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 expletive deleted, expletive, I'm not one of them. Now he's cussing like crazy, and it's the third time he's denied knowing Jesus. Then Peter's heart is broken.
It's a story that appears in every single gospel. Luke tells us that after Peter had denied him, Jesus looks back from his trial, looking for Peter. They make eye contact. Peter realizes what he's done. His heart is broken. Peter runs out and weeps bitterly. By the time Jesus is killed on the cross, Peter is long gone, hiding in fear. All of Peter's great expectations had come crashing down in that moment in the garden. This is perhaps no coincidence, as the concept of a garden plays a huge role in the Bible from its very beginning with the Garden of Eden. And in the last gospel written, the Gospel of John, Jesus' resurrection takes place in a garden. While the beginning of the Bible points to a garden as the scene of humanity's greatest loss, the Gospels end with another garden as the place of humanity's greatest redemption.
In looking at Jesus' resurrection, there's only one word that comes to mind: impossible. Dead is dead. There's simply no coming back from that. The gospel writers were, of course, aware of this, but how do you prove something like the resurrection to people 2,000 years after the fact? Even if you could, would it even work? Jesus ended one of his parables by saying, "They will not be convinced even if someone rises from the dead." For Jesus' resurrection to grip us in any meaningful way, it has to ring true on a level beyond just what you can see and touch. It has to mean something to you personally.
The Gospels present that the resurrection was every bit as hard for the people of that time to believe as it is for us now. Even so, it's the linchpin of their message. Shortly after hearing the news of his resurrection, Peter sees Jesus. But strangely, that evidence apparently did not change Peter much. It's what happened next that did. The final story in the Gospels ends with a beautiful moment between Peter and Jesus. Peter, along with some other disciples, had gone back to his old job of being a fisherman. Perhaps he was still dealing with the shame and disappointment he experienced in the garden, that the revolution was over, that Jesus was not the Messiah he was expecting. He was right. Jesus was not the Messiah Peter was expecting. But here, by the waters of the Sea of Galilee, Jesus was going to show Peter the kind of Messiah he really was. After having breakfast together, Jesus asks Peter a very personal question 3 times. Do you love me? 3 times Peter responds that he does, and 3 times Jesus asks him to take care of his sheep. Jesus knew he would be leaving soon, and here in the light of the morning sun, he wanted to show Peter what the true Messiah's mission was. It was not to kill or overthrow. Instead, he reminds Peter of the love that binds them, and he asks him to share that love with the world, to spread the revolution of this Messiah. In this moment with Jesus, confessing his love for him, Peter is completely transformed. To complete his redemption, Jesus gives Peter the same words he spoke to him when he first called him as a fisherman. Follow me. After this moment of redemption with the resurrected Jesus, Peter followed him with all of his passion and zeal. Peter became a titan of the early movement of Jesus' followers. It is traditionally believed that, like Jesus, Peter met his death on a cross. Somehow, this man who had been driven by such rage and anger, shame and disappointment was now willing to boldly take up his cross to die for Jesus, rather than respond to hatred with violence. He died a true revolutionary of the Messiah. The Gospels call on the reader to have the same moment with Jesus that Peter did, to experience how his love can completely change you. That is the true power of the Messiah.
Every evening, on the anniversary of September 11, something truly awe-inspiring happens. Thousands gather around Ground Zero to pay their respects, to grieve over who and what we lost, to remember. to see and feel the scars of what was left behind. In that moment, you can look up and find hope. Beams of light shoot up into the sky, piercing the darkness. That night, no matter where you are in the city, you can see it, bold and unmistakable. A message that this city won't be kept down. It can and will come back from anything. It's the same message we find at the end of the Gospels, that light overcomes darkness, that hope can be retrieved from disappointment, that in Jesus, we see a light unlike anything the world has ever seen. Because he was not the Messiah people were expecting. He was something more, something none of them could have ever dreamed of.